Well, good morning, friends. This is Morning Report. Today, we begin a three-part series titled Race, a Social Construct Created for Evil. That title is provocative on purpose. So I'm not here to deny people's stories or pretend history didn't happen. I'm here to tell the truth plainly. What we call race is not biology. It's not biology carved from stone. It's a man-made system of labels, laws, and incentives that powerful people use to justify terrible things. It's real in its consequences and flimsy in its foundations. So here's the plan. For part one, I'm going to explain what a social construct actually is, show how Europe in the 1600s set the mold, then trace how a pair of famous classifiers dressed up prejudice as science. We're going to connect explorers, travelogues, cabinets of curiosity, church politics, commerce, and some very confident men with quill pens. By the end, you will see how ideas hardened into paperwork, and paperwork authorized chains, and how the chains were called natural. Okay, so when people say race is a social construct, some people hear, "Oh, race is imaginary." That's not what I mean. A social construct is a human invention that societies enforce as if it were nature. Money is paper. Now, you agree to treat as value. It's just paper. A traffic light is colored glass that we all will decide that will control our 2-ton machines. Marriage licenses, borders, class schedules are constructs. They structure life. They matter because we make them matter. Apply that to race. Human biology shows gradual variations, not sealed boxes. Skin tones blend across geography. Hair textures, facial features, lactose tolerance, know a little bit about that one, change from place to place. Genetics conforms that any two random people are overwhelmingly alike. Yet across centuries, governments and institutions assigned meaning to visible differences, then embedded those meanings into law and custom. That's a construct, a set of invented categories that came to feel inevitable because courts, churches, and so on. Now, note a crucial difference. Ancestry is biological and measurable. It's the story of our DNA. Race is a label stuck to you by society, sometimes chosen, most often imposed. The two overlap, but they are not the same. Confusing them is how lazy biology excuses bad policy. To understand, this construct grew teeth. We have to leave the plantations for a minute and walk into a European bookstore, European universities, European harbor offices. The 1600s were the incubation period. Sailors, merchants, missionaries brought back stories. Those stories filled travelogues that flew off the presses in Amsterdam and London. Armchair scholars devoured them. Wealthy collectors displayed skulls and artifacts in cabinets of curiosity. That's why they're called curios, by the way, if you didn't know. Placing human remains beside crocodiles and shells and clocks. Physiognomy, I'll say that correctly, the idea that you can read the soul from the face was fashionable. Della Porta's arguments that skull shape revealed moral quality lingered like perfume on powdered wigs. Darker skin and tightly curled hair were not only different, they were interpreted. The interpretation did the damage. People were sorted out into civilized versus savages, rational versus childlike. These weren't scientific conclusions, they were moral grades disguised as observations carried home on the, and of course, empires needed a story. Spain and Portugal leaned on church decrees authorizing conquest of the heathens. The Dutch and the English professionalized it through the chartered companies and treated human cargoes as just another column on a ledger. When profit met prejudice, justification wrote itself. Okay, enter French physician named Francois Bernier. In 1684, he tried dividing humanity into large groups based on geography and physical traits. It wasn't yet full-blown race science, but it was rehearsal. The key move was simple. Turn a swirled spectrum of human variety into bold boxes. Then assign characters to the boxes. Once you do that, cruelty starts to look like common sense. Meanwhile, colonial legislatures were tinkering with law. Early Virginia tied a child's status to the mother, locking bondage into heredity. Blackness became a lifetime sentence. Whiteness a shield. The legal code did not cite DNA. It cited convenience and control. But the code needed a philosophy that felt respectable in European salons, living rooms. And that's where the classification became a weapon. In the 1700s, Carl Linnaeus revolutionized biology by naming and ordering the natural world. So he decided to classify human beings into continental subspecies and fatally to mix those labels with moral commentary. Europeans were described as inventive and lawful. Africans were cast as lazy and capricious. Asians were grave, and indigenous Americans were stubborn. It's prejudice dressed for graduation. And then came Johann Blumenbach, who he examined skulls and coined the term that we use today called Caucasian, and arranged 5 varieties with Europeans the ideal center. He claimed unity of the human species even as his writings encouraged a hierarchy. Okay, he claimed unity, but his writings said there is a hierarchy. The move was subtle. Defend a single human family while gently placing one branch on a pedestal. We know where that pedestal leads. It props up everything from polite discrimination to lethal atrocity. Here's the core problem with these systems. They pretend to describe nature while actually prescribing status. Once the taxonomy is in your textbook, you can claim that you're only enforcing the way that the world is. The plantation owner, the colonial official, the bureaucrat now have citations to point at, and the citations loop back to the travelers who moralized what they saw. Now, I use the word evil in the title for a reason. Evil is not only individual cruelty, it's systems that convert sin into habit, and then habit into policy. The race construct did exactly that. It transformed greed into law and turned fear into an algorithm. It narrowed the sacred idea that every person bears God's image into a ranking spreadsheet of who counts and how much. So let's take the Atlantic slave trade. It was not a tragic misunderstanding. It was logistics perfected, routes optimized, cargo insured, bodies priced. The math of misery required a moral buffer. That moral buffer was race as destiny. Africans became naturally fit for bondage. Europeans became naturally fit to rule. The construct circulated from pulpits to courtroom benches to shipping manifests. Then, when resistance rose, the construct shifted costumes from theology to science. Same message, fancier phrasing. Because once you label, you lock a label in the law, the world you create starts to look like the label was right all along. Deny schooling, then conclude the group you deprived is uninterested in learning. Segregate neighborhoods, then point at the poverty you engineered as evidence of inferiority. Over and under police, then cite arrest statistics as natural speaking. That's the loop. The construct creates the condition it claims to describe. This is why I push back on the idea that race is harmless, is a harmless shorthand. No, the shorthand wrote the rules, and the rules wrote lives. If someone tells you that the problem is just a few bad apples, they are missing the orchard. The orchard was mapped in Europe, planted in the colonies, and fenced by law. Now, let me speak plainly from a conservative perspective that takes human dignity, responsibility, and ordered liberty seriously. First, equal treatment under the law is not a slogan. Equal treatment under the law is not a slogan. It is a shield for the weak. Colorblind law is not pretending differences don't exist. It's refusing to let the government assign worth or opportunity based on a label invented. Second, we measure reality because we care about people, not because we want to ossify categories. The data use data diagnostically, not as a destiny. This approach refuses two lies. Lie one, race explains everything. Lie two, race explains nothing. The truth sits in the hard middle. History built structures. Individuals navigate them. Justice demands that we fix the structures and call individuals to responsibility. At the same time, that balance is not fashionable in our short first area, but it's only a path that honors both truth and agency. Billy Graham famously said he believed the next move of God would be believers making a difference in the marketplace. In the fall of 2019, Anton Kresik moved to Washington, D.C. And as Anton began his career in the political arena, two things became obvious. Godly principles were lacking on both sides of the aisle, and many organizations were putting profits before people. 7 Weeks Coffee was started to reverse this trend and live out Graham's calling as believers in the marketplace. As a values-based business, 7 Weeks Coffee has a simple and transparent mission. Donate 10%, a tithe, of every sale to pregnancy care centers across the nation. They are committed to earning your trust, not expecting it. So how do they do this? Leading with their values, showing the impact and providing the highest quality product. I am a Christian. I'm conservative. And 7 Weeks Coffee unapologetically supports pregnancy care centers across the nation. Please join us by letting your coffee serve a greater purpose. All right, let's bring this thread back to Europe, because the intellectual habit did not stop with Linnaeus and Blumenbach. Their categories seeped into universities, their categories seeped into museums and policy offices. European powers told themselves they were the guardians of civilization, tasked with uplifting or ruling the lesser people. That story soothed consciences. While ships moved and land changed hands, even reformers were tempted by the hierarchy. Meanwhile, ordinary Europeans and Americans absorbed the taxonomy without ever reading a scientific treatise. They saw the effects, who took orders, who gave them, who lived where, who sat on juries. Children grew up amid cues that felt like nature but were constructed. The more normal it looked, the more natural it felt. And that is the danger with social constructs. Once they are normalized, they hide in plain sight and punish dissenters as if they were heretics against reality. All right. And for those of us who take scripture seriously, the antidote starts with a very old truth that every person bears the image of God. That is the most explosive equality statement ever made. It wipes out hierarchies rooted in pigment or skull size. It also constrains us. If every face reflects the divine, then contempt is a theological error, and injustice is an offense against heaven. This is not soft talk. It's harder than the brittle pride of superiority because it demands repentance and repair, not just rhetoric. At the same time, that's the hard part for people. At the same time, a biblical view of humanity sees differences as gifts to steward, not excuses to dominate. Cultures carry wisdom and blind spots. Nations have callings and cruelties. The conservative task is to preserve what is good, reform what is broken, and refuse utopian fantasies that promise equality by force. Race categories tempt governments to micromanage souls. That way lies either tyranny or tribalism. And I think that we are living in the world that we have both. So, what's a sane society to do? Start with law, enforce civil rights protections vigorously for individuals, make it easy to prove discrimination and faster to remedy it, ditch the lazy shortcut of quotas. If a school district is failing, don't juggle racial ratios, give family choices and attach dollars to students. If a hospital uses race adjustments that shortchange patients, replace the proxy with ancestry, environment, and patients' actual conditions. In policing, focus on crime hotspots. Economically, simplify the rules that lock people out of work. Cut the red tape around apprenticeships and licensing. Reward marriage and work. These reforms aren't race-based, they're reality-based. They help anyone who's been boxed out. And yes, because history is uneven, that will even reduce disparities without recreating the very categories we're trying to retire. All right. Culture moves policies. We've heard Andrew Breitbart says that politics is downstream from the culture. So culture moves policy. We need new habits. We need new habits of speech. Stop using terms like white and black as total explanations. Stop treating minorities like mascots for one party or another. Listen to individuals. Listen to individuals, not archetypes. Reward leaders who tell the truth when it is inconvenient to their own tribe. When you hear the old physiognomy in modern clothes claim that character leaks from skin tone, or that dissenters betray their race, say no with your whole chest. Teach history with moral clarity. Yes, discuss slavery, segregation, lynching, redlining. Also discuss abolitionists, Black entrepreneurs who built towns under pressure, the churches that nurtured courage, the immigrants who joined the American story, and many interracial alliances that bent the arc towards justice. Tell the entire truth, not because guilt is useful, but because gratitude and responsibility are. Okay, now part one is just the groundwork. We have laid out what a social construct is, followed the European prequel, and watched the prejudice receive Latin names and official seals. We've seen how law conjured the world it claimed to discover. In part two, we'll turn to the American laboratories, slave codes, the one drop rule, Jim Crow, and the complicated ways people resisted, survived, and sometimes adopted the very labels meant to control them. In part three, we'll come home to the present and how to retire the bad categorization. Now, before we get out of here today, allow me something. Some of you have been told calling race a construct erases your story. No, it does not. It honors your story by naming the lie that was used to wound you or your ancestors. Otherwise, others have been told that discussing race at all is division. No, silence freezes injustice in its place, right? The way through is harder. Judge people by their character and conduct, yes, and also judge systems by their outcomes and incentives. That position will not fit on a bumper sticker. Here's what I want you to do this week. Read one of the primary sources from the era that we discussed: a travelogue, a plantation law, a scientific passage. See how confident they sound while saying nonsense. Confidence is not truth. Then have just one small conversation with someone who doesn't share your background and ask about their family story. Listen for the human details, those details that history books flatten. That habit, curiosity with backbone, is how citizens break bad constructs without burning down the house. All right, let's camp a little longer on the meaning of constructed. A construct is not fake by the way a toy sword is fake. It's not the same thing. It's a real way that the US dollar is real. Okay. Enforced and capable of blessing or bankrupting it. Race worked like currency. It told people that they were worth before a word was spoken. It traveled with them across borders. It could be exchanged for privilege or punishment. And like currency, it could be devalued, counterfeited, and redesigned by the authorities in charge. Consider how flexible the boxes have been. The US Census has revised racial categories again and again and again. At various points, Irish and Italians were treated as questionably white and then fully white. Mexicans were white in one decade and another, and other in another. South Africa, colored described a bureaucratic in between. In Latin America, dozens of caste labels policed a ladder of many people that they climbed or fell down, depending on your town, the year, and the official behind the desk. Europe's print shops in the 1600s did to ideas what Harbor did to goods. They moved them quickly and in bulk. Amsterdam's presses pumped out maps with decorative cartoons of exotic people. Jesuit letters home blended heartfelt evangelism with patronizing portraits of the heathens, which moralists in Paris folded into sermons. Natural philosophers like Kircher gathered reports of monstrous races at the edge of the earth, while collectors like O. Worm arranged cabinets that collapsed. Among popular volumes was Richard Lygon's account of Barbados, which alternated praise for the island's riches with contempt for enslaved Africans whose labor made those riches. English readers learned a story in which dark skin and bondage appeared together so frequently they felt linked by nature rather than by ships and whips. The story hardened a habit. See a face? Assume a place. Okay, so we also need to talk about the triangle holding the new imagination together. At one corner stood religion. Spain and Portugal relied on papal bulls that licensed conquest of pagans, turning missionary language into imperial policy. At another corner stood law. English law adapted to colonial necessity, tolerating lifelong servitude for Africans and their children, even when similar bondage for Europeans was deemed excessive. The third corner okay, we need to also talk about the triangle holding this new imagination together. At one corner stood religion. Spain and Portugal relied on papal bulls that licensed conquest of the pagans, turning missionary language into imperial policy. At another corner stood law. English law adopted to colonial necessity, tolerating lifelong servitude for Africans and their children, even when similar bondage for Europeans was deemed as excessive. And the third corner stood profit. Sugar plantations, devoured bodies. The Dutch and the Dutch West India Company, and later England's Royal African Company made human trade a bureaucratic routine, complete with stockholders and dividends. This Ascentio system carved out monopolies to deliver people as cargo. Ledgers made the moral questions feel optional. When a practice fits neatly into a double entry bookkeeping, humans have an ugly habit of calling it reasonable. Francois Bernier's essay, Dividing the World into Four Groups, was not a lonely pamphlet. It was one output from a European conversation that mixed travel notes with moral judgment. Around the same time, English Caribbean wrote different kinds of documents. In the 1661 Barbados Slave Code, it authorized brutal control that made the distinction between Negroes and Europeans explicit. That code became a template. Colonies borrowed its logic, if not the exact articles, and the Atlantic would learn to pair. Here's a hard truth for my fellow admirers of liberty. John Locke, champion of rights, helped draft the fundamental Constitution of Carolina. That document protected hereditary nobility and codified slavery. Ideas about natural freedom coexisted with ownership of human beings because race had already begun its work. It carved out an exception. All men are free became all the right men are free. That's how constructs excuse themselves. In 1662, Virginia adopted partes sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother. That one sentence converted children into property if the mother was enslaved. If you were born to a slave, you're a slave. It also incentivizes the exploitation of enslaved women. Keep them pregnant. All the babies they make will be slaves, right? In 1705, Virginia's slave codes stacked penalty after penalty to keeping categories rigid. Compare that with the shifting status of Europeans who arrived as indentured servants, but could expect freedom after some term. Race supplied the mold. Law poured concrete into it. Billy Graham famously said he believed the next move of God would be believers making a difference in the marketplace. In the fall of 2019, Anton Kresik moved to Washington, D.C. And as Anton began his career in the political arena, two things became obvious. Godly principles were lacking on both sides of the aisle, and many organizations were putting profits before people. 7 Weeks Coffee was started to reverse this trend and live out Graham's calling as believers in the marketplace. As a values-based business, 7 Weeks Coffee has a simple and transparent mission. Donate 10%, a tithe, of every sale to pregnancy care centers across the nation. They are committed to earning your trust, not expecting it. So how do they do this? Leading with their values, showing the impact and providing the highest quality product. I am a Christian. I'm conservative. And 7 Weeks Coffee unapologetically supports pregnancy care centers across the nation. Please join us by letting your coffee serve a greater purpose. All right, let's go back to Linnaeus. His genius in botany is diminished. Order helps scientists talk to one another across languages. The problem was the moral freight he snuck into human categories. Classifying trees did not affect the tree's rights. Classifying people licensed rulers to assign rights. Add the flattering adjectives to the group on the top and the shaming adjectives to the groups beneath. And ranking looks like a mirror rather than a ladder. Blumenbach, for his part, examined skulls and declared the Georgian skulls the most beautiful, placing Caucasian at the imagined origin. His samples suffered from a problem we call selection bias today. The skulls he saw were the skulls he had, right? But museums, universities treated his assessments as objective, and the objectivity bled into policy. It is a short distance from a display case to a statue. 18th century Europe housed a debate between monogenics, who said that the human family was one, and polygenics, right, who argued that separate origins for different races. It sounded academic, but the policy stakes were huge. If separate origins were true, slavery and colonial hierarchy seemed even more natural. If one origin was true, then God's image extended to everywhere, which constrained cruelty. Even amongst monogenists like Blumenbach, the hierarchy still remained. Unity on paper, superiority in practice. '18th century Europe housed a debate between monogenics, who said that the human family was one, and polygenics, right, who argued that separate origins for different races. It sounded academic, but the policy stakes were huge. If separate origins were true, slavery and colonial hierarchy seemed even more natural. If one origin was true, then God's image extended to everywhere, which constrained cruelty. Even amongst monogenists like Blumenbach, the hierarchy still remained. Unity on paper, superiority in practice. Fast forward the tape. These taxonomies supplied rhetoric for slaveholders in the Americas, justification for the Code Noir in French colonies, and later for pseudoscientific movements that weighted skulls and measured noses. By the time the 19th century rolled around, scientific racism had an apparatus. Societies, journals, and lectures. The seed planted in the 1600s sprouted in the Enlightenment greenhouse and bloomed in the Industrial Age, when governments wanted conscripts, laborers, or such. You can trace a line from these classifications to apartheid's racial ladder and the American Jim Crow within the bizarre uh, arithmetic of blood. You can trace a line from immigration quotas designed to keep out the wrong stock to treaties that describe whole peoples as wards and to medical charts that use race as a shortcut instead of treating patients as individuals. The malady isn't a single bad act, it is a set of assumptions based on institutions until they forget who did the backing. All right, think about housing. Redlining maps shaded neighborhoods by risk, which often meant by race. Deny mortgages there, and the values stagnate. Later, these low values are cited as evidence that residents don't invest. That's the loop. Think about schools. Assign the least experienced teachers to the hardest classrooms, which they still do, by the way, then marvel when scores land. Blame the students. Think about law enforcement. Flood high crime areas with stops. Collect minor violations by the thousands. And surprise, your spreadsheet shows that crime is high there. Here's what conservatives should keep, and here's what they should drop. Conservatism, at its best, respects reality, human nature, incentives, traditions, and limits of power. It should keep its insistence on equal justice, on family formation, and on community institutions that teach virtue. It should drop the reflex to defend systems simply because they're old and should refuse any new systems that relabels people by race to engineer outcomes. We tried that sort of sorting before. The next time will not redeem the first time. It will repeat with fresh fonts. Education. Fund students, not systems. Expand high performing charter schools and vocational programs. Use transparent metrics and publish them so families can vote with their feet. Safety. Concentrate policing on repeat violent offenders and gun traffickers. Pair enforcement with mentorships and job training. Health. Retire crude race adjustments and replace them with ancestry, exposure, and personalized risk. Encourage medical research that looks at specific gene variants and environmental factors. The economy. Cut out the barriers to entry for small businesses, permitting delays, excessive licensing, and tax cliffs that punish work. Marriage and family. Strengthen policies that remove penalties for two-parent households and reward the stability that helps children thrive. None of these requires the state to ask what race you are. It requires the state to act like a referee, not a puppeteer. Here's some stuff that you can do tomorrow. Inside our homes and churches, we can practice better storytelling. Stop using people as examples of a category. Ask for names, not boxes. When a friend says, as a whatever, you must think this. Resist the script. Let people surprise you. Teach your kids how to spot propaganda, including the flattering kind, the physiognomy that whispers on social media. This faith equals fate. Train the next generation to answer no. That's not how truth works. This is hard, but use a little humor helps. When someone speaks about science as if it were a white coat and never makes mistakes, remind them that the early scientists also weighed skulls and call that wisdom. We can chuckle without becoming cynics. The point is to mock science, okay, or not to mock science. Really, it is to keep science honest by separating description from decree. You know, here's what used to happen. If you were sick, a little bloodletting was a good idea, right? And then people died of the infection from putting leeches on people. That was the science. Trust the science. And a little humility helps too. We all want to sort the world into neat stacks. The human mind loves shortcuts. The cure is not to stop categorizing it, it's to refuse to do whatever the categories seem to say. Okay, now look at your forms: job applications, school paperwork, health surveys, boxes everywhere. Some boxes exist because courts needed to measure discrimination. Fair enough. But be careful. What begins as a diagnostic tool can become a destiny if we stop asking whether the tool is still fits the task. The goal should be a society where the boxes shrink, not expand, where the measure that we measure what matters and that we retire the rest. All right, let me close with this. Picture this if you can. Imagine a courtroom where that has a thumb on the scale. Okay. The judge insists the scale is neutral. After all, it's made of brass. You point to the thumb. He says the thumb is part of tradition. You remove the thumb. Suddenly the weights change. The judge claims you broke the scale. No, you finally used it as designed. Race categories were the thumb. They made injustice feel like balance. All right, part two will take us into the case, under the case law and customs manumission, and it limits and all of its limits. Anti miscegenation, that's a hard word, statuses, and the census categories refined power, and the bizarre logics of passing, and how economic policy compounded the harm. We'll meet the abolitionists, the opportunists, heroes, and hypocrites. Part three will map how to dismantle the leftover scaffolding without tearing down the house. We've done hard work before. We can do it again. My name is Willie Lawson. This is the Morning Report, and this is part one of Race, a social construct created for evil. Truth doesn't require a costume. It requires a spine, a steady voice. Let's keep them both. See you next time.